welcome to my podcast. This is actually the very first of what is intended to be a series of podcasts about spirituality and my experiences over the last 3 or 4 years of intense mystical adventure. The reason I'm making podcasts as opposed to, for example, videos on YouTube or something, the reason I'm making podcasts is I have very limited internet connection. I am living in a 1-story, 4-meter by 6-meter wood cabin on the outskirts of the Amazon rainforest. And I have electricity, there's a well here, there's no internet. And in order to use the internet, I must walk about 20 minutes into a nearby village and use the internet at a hostel, which is limited in terms of bandwidth. And so I'm unable easily and conveniently to upload large files such as video. So I'm recording audio instead and compressing it heavily so that it's a quick upload. It means it should also be a quick download for you guys. And the reason I'm here is because I am a modern renunciate. And I mean renunciate to refer to the practices of the guys who are called the Desert Fathers. And in the first millennium AD, they decided to renounce the world, to renounce money, to renounce private property, personal property. And to go they went into the desert where they lived in caves. They lived either alone, totally alone, with no support whatsoever, and supported themselves by they often wove baskets, which they would exchange for food and so on. Or they would live in small groups together. They separate accommodations, and they would get together to eat and stuff like that. The Desert Fathers, they basically decided that they had had enough with the world as it was then. Goodness knows what they'd make of it now. I absolutely understand where they're coming from, though, and I decided, to try it for myself, because I was tired of complaining. I was sick of. I wasn't sick. And nor was I tired, actually. And I'm correcting my language here because I am part of my method, part of the spiritual method that I have learned, been taught over the last few years by Spirit, is to be very careful with my language, especially around certain topics, because it matters. And so I don't say things like I am tired, or I was tired, or I am sick, or I was sick. I don't say things like that because I wasn't literally sick, nor was I literally tired. I reached a point where I was no longer satisfied with simply complaining about the world. Nor was I interested in continuing thinking about how it can be improved. And I reached the point where I said, if you can't beat them, leave them. I tried joining them, kind of. I mean, I was never really much of a team player as far as society went, from my earliest days. But I gave it a shot, and it didn't work for me. The way that modern humans have structured their societies, the Western, in particular, the Western culture, which is now basically global. As far as East versus West goes, if there ever was a cultural war between East versus West, it's clear who the winner was, in quotes. And I simply do not agree. My last 3 or 4 years have persuaded me that the Western way of seeing the world, the materialistic, consumerist, humanist, reductionist, nihilistic, atheistic viewpoint, which is I believe the actual belief system of most Westerners, and I use Westerners in quotes, because as I say, it is more of a global thing now. And when I say Westerners and the West, well, that's not to say I think I'm using that term accurately in a geographical sense. It's not accurate geographically anymore. It does, however, it identifies, So from now on, perhaps I will say the materialist viewpoint. I started this mystical adventure an atheist, hardcore militant atheist, Richard Dawkins style. I was Richard Dawkins Jr. and had been since I was old enough to think about that kind of stuff. I simply saw no evidence for anything spiritual or magical or mysterious. I saw no mysterium tremendum anywhere I looked, and I came to the conclusion that religious claims, metaphysical claims, have no merit if one is objective. And that's where I was coming from for the vast majority of my life. And I was miserable a lot of the time. I was not... I suffered, or I experienced a lot of depression. A lot of, what would happen for me was that the sadness and hopelessness and negative feelings that I would get from my stories about the world, about how bad things are and how wrong they are and how awful, and I would feel like I became overwhelmed by the sadness, and I would go out and I would hit the booze. I would drink alcohol to numb myself, basically, as a sort of self-medicating, as a depressive, and alcohol being a depressant, not necessarily the most logical choice. It's a very common one for people, though. And so it's not that I was an alcoholic in the classic sense of drinking every day and, drinking as soon as waking up and as soon as I woke up, that kind of thing. I could go days or weeks or even months without. In my life, I've been years without drinking. It's just most periods of my life, the story is I would get overwhelmed and I'd go out and drink, and I would get very, very drunk, and I would damage relationships and break friendships and have blackouts and wake up feeling, oh, I need to apologize to somebody and not knowing who, and having to call around likely candidates and say, was it you that I offended last night? Oh, it was. Okay, do I need a new friend? Yeah, okay. Sorry. Nice knowing you. And that happened over and over and over again. And I was completely spiritually ignorant. But what I did do was I went to Alcoholics Anonymous for the third attempt. Over the course of about a year, about 4 years ago, I tried Alcoholics Anonymous 3 times. The first time I went, I sat in the church where the meeting was being held, and I looked up at the banner on the wall with the steps, with the 12 steps listed. It's always hanging on the wall for every meeting. I looked up at that, and step 1, you're not doing this alone. You're doing this with your higher power, whatever that means to you. And the first time I said, well, I'm an atheist, so skip what's step 2. That didn't work. I relapsed quickly. My second attempt, and I went to a few meetings. It wasn't just one. My second attempt, again, I went to a few meetings. The first one, sitting there again, looking up at that step 1. I thought, well, okay, I'm going to say what I can make fit with my worldview as it stood then is the idea perhaps that there's a group consciousness that kind of emerges from all of these people being gathered together with the same cause. That perhaps there emerges a sort of greater consciousness that I can consider my higher power and work on, go forward and proceed on that basis. Which made sense to me at the time. Unfortunately, that didn't work either. And it wasn't unfortunate. It was there was no luck involved. So the third time, so I relapsed quickly. Third attempt. I remember walking there and thinking to myself, this is it. If this attempt doesn't work, I'm done. So I go there and I look at that step one, and I didn't even have, as I said, I was very spiritually ignorant. I had no language for this kind of stuff. This vocabulary was totally unknown to me at the time. But I set the intention. I sat there and set the intention of finding a higher power that actually works for me. Instead of, coming up with stuff that little cheats, as I kind of saw them. I sincerely set the intention. And I went home that night and went to find a book to read. And on my bookcase, I went to my bookcase, and right in front of me, in line with my nose, at eye level, was a book that I'd bought perhaps 2 years before in a used bookstore. And from a shelf labeled Eastern Philosophies or something, I'd scooped up a bunch of books because they were cheap and paid for them and put them on my shelf and never looked at them again. There were a couple of books on logic. There was a book of the sayings of Confucius. And the one that was right in front of me on the bookcase that I hadn't picked up again since buying it, I hadn't heard of the author, I hadn't given it a second thought, actually, was called The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And I looked at that book. I got a really good feeling. I took it down and I thought, well, I've seen The Daily Show. I've seen their moment of Zen at the end. It's kind of bizarre and weird and funny and irreverent in a way, and it doesn't seem very religious. Maybe I'll find a higher power in here. So I read it over the next few days, and the way that Watts describes seeing the world in that book was so radically different from how I was seeing the world at that time. I had a fairly standard model of the world, perhaps more cynical than average, and still fairly standard, I think. For example, I saw time as, if you imagine a line all the way across a horizontal line, all the way across your field of vision from left to right, and the very left end of this line is labeled past, and in the middle, right in the center, directly ahead, is a section. It switches from past to present. And then instantaneously, immediately then switches to the future, and the future extends out all the way to the right. So what I'm saying, so that's how I saw time. Basically, is as past, and then this infinite, almost infinitesimally small, almost non-existent sliver that we call the present, and then future, all the way to the right. That's how I saw the world. This sort of sliver of time, of now, this moment that moves rightwards, 1 second per second. And however, in the way of Zen, that's not how he presents time. In the way of Zen, it's very clear. He makes very clear that there is only now. And I'd heard this idea. I wasn't that ignorant. I'd heard the idea that there is only now. There's no past, there's no future and stuff. And I considered it New Age, crystally wank. That might be sort of theoretically true, but serves no practical, has no practical benefit, practical purpose whatsoever. No sort of no reason for giving it a second thought. However, that idea presented in the context of Zen, of the way that he was describing it, made a lot of sense to me. And so, and there were a few ideas in there that just blew my mind. So I decided, okay, my way of seeing the world is really not working for me. I want to see the world this way, the way he's describing. And how am I going to do that? Well, what I came up with was this idea of monitoring and filtering my thoughts, my speech, my behavior, to ensure that every single thing I said, did, and thought was in line with the way of Zen, the way that he describes. Every single one, without giving myself any wiggle room, not letting myself cheat. And and so that's what I did. Again, I didn't have this language. I set the intention of doing that, of seeing the world the Zen way. And I very, very rigorously, with great fervor, actually, set about this, doing this. Like a mental gym, going to the gym for the mind. And I did not let any thoughts go by, those filters that were not, that should have been filtered out. I did not allow myself to cheat. Well, so I would monitor my thoughts, and I had never really done that on a sort of systematic, in any kind of systematic way before. So I began monitoring my thoughts and categorizing them and identifying them. And so for example, if I was sitting there sitting on the bus, thinking about a conversation I'd had the day before, and if only I'd said something else, it would have gone differently, and I might have come out on top, that kind of thing. And then I would remember, I'm monitoring. So what am I doing right now? This is a past thought, first of all, and we know that the past isn't real; it's just memories. What I'm doing is I'm remembering now. So it's always now. I'm remembering something now, and I'm regretting having said something instead of something else. And that's the past. It's, in quotes, it's memories. There's nothing I can do about that now. And so I would remind myself that this is what Alan Watts would say. And I did, and then I would bring myself back to the present moment. And I used a trick that I'd read on the internet, I think, sort of technique that I'd read on the internet, where one says, okay, what can I see right now? What can I hear? What can I taste? What can I smell? What can I touch? Etc. right now. And you find one or three things of each or whatever that are happening right now, and it just brings one back to the present moment. And I did that every time. Every single time I had a thought, I categorized it, and I said, is this acceptable to me now? Would this be acceptable to Alan Watts, the way he's describing seeing the world in that book? And if it wouldn't have been acceptable, and I was brutal, this is something else that I had to develop and really practice, was brutal honesty with myself about whether a particular thought was serving me in the moment. And if not, then I changed it or I got rid of it. Deliberately, intentionally did those things with every single thought. And at first I would have to do it every 4, 5, 6 seconds. And I did. And I started meditating. That's something else that I hadn't ever tried. Really. So I started meditating and keeping these ideas that I'd read in this book, keeping those ideas in my mind all the time. And I quickly realized that it was the little voice. Basically, once I opened myself up to meditation and the possibility of doing something about my state of mind, doing something really effective, unlike antidepressants, which I'd tried all different kinds of, and they hadn't worked. They had awful side effects, or sort of side effects that certainly didn't work for me. Once I became interested in that, became open to that idea of self-mental training, I began to see it. I became more open-minded to the whole thing, and I started seeing words everywhere, words on every surface, horizontal, vertical, floor, ceiling. I'd be sitting on the bus perhaps, and there are ads on the floor, there are ads on the ceiling, there are words, logos, brands on people's clothing and their shoes. There are words written in the sky by planes. There are songs playing in every store with lyrics, words, 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 words. And if I recognize that, if I'm able to speak that language, then it's instantly a thought in my head, or it's a thought in my mind, automatically, right? That's how we're trained as children. We're trained to be able to read and to be able to comprehend speech automatically without trying. We are never trained, at least the vast majority of children are not trained to stop and to not do that, and how to be in an environment where there are words, these potential alien thoughts everywhere, without becoming infected by them and caught up in it all. That's not something that's taught to the vast majority of people. So simply by looking around, even inside my apartment, simply by looking, it was difficult. I realized it was difficult to find a single direction in which I could look, where I couldn't see words and didn't have other people's thoughts being thrust into my mind. Especially going outside of my apartment, going on the bus, going to the mall. I mean, it's words everywhere, unrelenting sort of carnival, freak show, a linguistic freak show, and I started thinking of it a little bit like mental rape, because I don't want these thoughts. I have my own thoughts, and I'm dealing with them. Thank you. I realize at the same time I realized it's this little voice in my head. It's this internal narrative, the blah blah thoughts. This thing that I call me and I. It's that thing that's babbling away morning to night, most of the time about things that I have really no interest in. What am I going to have for dinner? Why is that guy wearing those socks? Does he not realize that those socks are revolting? On and on and on and on and on. This internal narrative, blah, 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 blah. Driving me nuts. No breaks between the thoughts, so-called thoughts. No breaks between this, blah, blah. No gaps whatsoever where I would wake up and instantly, boom, blah, 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 blah. Before I'd even gotten out of bed. Right up until I could fall, once I could fall asleep, given the fact that this thing was going blah, blah, blah. A lot of insomnia, and eventually I would fall asleep despite this thing. And so my only respite was sleep, unconsciousness. And it was driving me bonkers, absolutely mental. I mean, I realized this as part of this process. And so I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm meditating, man. I'm dealing with my own incessant babbling. I don't need the rest of the world babbling at me at the same time. I don't need marketing professionals paid in total many billions of dollars a year to compete with each other and to use the latest scientific research to shove their ideas as deeply and permanently as they can into my mind. They are competing over my mind space, my mind share, my eyeballs. I don't need that. Not at the moment, So I decided I'm going to withdraw from language completely. I want to deal only with the thoughts in my head. So I had no job because I was living off savings. I had lots of time. I lived by myself in my apartment. So I covered my bookshelf with a sheet so I couldn't see the titles. I stopped reading, which was huge for me. I could read 7-8 hours a day. That doesn't include time spent on my computer as well for the rest of the time I was awake, reading, more or less. So I stopped doing that. I stopped using my computer. I stopped speaking. I stopped hearing people speak. If I could hear words, I either left or I put on headphones and listened to music with no lyrics. And I turned all the products around in my kitchen so that the fewest words were visible, in the bathroom as well. I sort of de-worded my house as much as possible, unlanguaged my house, my apartment as much as I could, and simply meditated. So no words. And much later, I learned of Vipassana meditation, where this is what one does. Basically, one goes to a center, a retreat, and simply meditates without language, outside of language, for a minimum of 10 days, up to, I believe, 60. And I didn't know about this at the time. I in quotes, intuited this idea and practiced that too, very diligently, no exception. I became completely separated from any language using primates, completely. And so I went in for lots of walks in nature. Lots of walks in green areas. It's all nature, and lots of meditating. I mean, what else is there to do, really? And I did that. Basically, I set no time limit. I said until something happens. And that took about 7 weeks. After about 7 weeks, I was sitting on the bus. I seem to have spent a lot of time in that period on the bus. But anyway, I was sitting on the bus and just staring at the floor. Fortunately, there was no ad on. Not fortunately, there was no ad on that bus on the floor. However, there were words everywhere else. So I was looking at and by words I include symbols that have well-known meanings, like a no smoking sign or or the standard male and female bathroom signs, etc. I count those because they cause thoughts as well. I was sitting on the bus, studiously avoiding looking at words and having anybody else's thoughts in my head, when I realized suddenly I haven't had a thought in at least 5 seconds, 5, 6, 7 seconds, and I at the same time realized, bollocks! By thinking that, I just broke the silence. The gap between my thoughts, the first one that I had ever noticed, at least. It may not have been the first gap between the babbling in my life. It was certainly the first that I witnessed, for which I wasn't distracted doing something else. And it was, I realized in that 7 seconds, what's underneath that babbling is the most beautiful, profound, divine silence. And I could find no words. As I said, I was an atheist, militant, hardcore, zealous atheist. And I could find no words to describe that silence, other than that I touched God. And so I allowed myself to write. I allowed myself one exception to my silence, to my my Vipassana in quotes, in order to email my family and tell them what happened. I was quoting St. Augustine and John Wesley, the great Methodist preacher, and I doubled down on my practice. I said, I'm okay. I want that again. Yes, please. Yes, please. That was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced, and perhaps still. And I'm having that again. I'm making that gap. That gap's coming back. I'm making it longer. And oh yeah. So, and I set those intentions. And it didn't take long. Another 2 or 3 weeks from that point, I found myself with almost no babbling anymore. I estimated I had got rid of, in quotes, I had untrained myself, my brain, from having something like 80% of the activity that was there previously, the blah blah. Something like 80% went away after over the 2 or 3 weeks following that initial 7 seconds of silence, which happened after about 7 weeks of Vipassana, and 7 weeks of not only, but except that the difference between what I did in Vipassana is, in Vipassana one at first focuses on bodily sensations and that kind of thing. I believe. I've never done it. This is merely, I'm repeating what I've heard. My method was to self-monitor and to correct or cancel any thought not in line with the way of Zen as described by Mr. Watts. And so I call this active meditation. I'm sure I'm not the first to have used that term. I don't know. I haven't Googled it. So if it's a trademark, I'll call it something else. For the time being, I'm calling it active meditation. And in my opinion, it is a more effective way of meditating if one is setting out to retrain one's brain in some way. And I believe that's actually why a lot of people do meditate. Maybe they want to feel calm, they want to experience, they want to be more peaceful. I think ultimately what that means is creating a more peaceful mind, mental space for oneself. And I think, in my opinion, the method that I was inspired, basically, to use is very effective. I'm not saying it's the most effective, and I'm not, you know, I'm not even claiming it's more effective than Vipassana. What I'm simply saying it was effective for me. And basically, as soon as it happened, as soon as I'd realized that I've got, holy shit, this blah blah voice thing, there's about 20% of it left. The rest of the time it's silence and deliberate thinking only. So deliberate thinking and then a bit of babbling. What I had actually at that first point, so that at that point I decided I'm going to do some research into this. I want to share this with people. You know, it was so beautiful. The silence that became my almost permanent companion. Other than what remained of the babbling was what I call rehearsing conversations with people, whatever, that most of the time never even happened, and when they did happen, these conversations certainly almost never went as I'd anticipated. So this rehearsing was pointless. However, and was something that I resolved to also remove. However, it was good enough for me. The rehearsals made up a small percentage of my mentation, right? And so I was happy with that. I was happy with getting rid of the rest of it. So active meditation. What did I get rid of? I untrained my brain from automatically judging situations as good or bad. I stopped doing that. I didn't allow myself to do that. I said things are as they are. They cannot be any different right now. And by calling them bad, I'm causing myself suffering. As Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, the setting apart of the good from the bad is the disease of the mind. And so I decided I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not setting myself up for suffering by calling things bad and wrong and trouble and problem and failure. So I stopped using those words. And I found the good in every situation. And I stopped judging people. Because I realized I don't know what they've been through today, this week, this year. And here I am calling them an asshole for doing the kind of thing that I do all the time. You know, and it struck me as nonsense. Antisocial nonsense. So I stopped doing that too. So I stopped judging. That was really the extent of my now thinking. You know, at the beginning, as I used to be. Pardon me, as I used to be. That was the extent of my now thinking. If I was thinking about it now, it was pretty much only ever judging. So I stopped that, and I stopped pointless thinking about the past and the future, neither of which really exist. And when I found myself in the past or in the future, it's almost always the past. Actually, it was, I don't know. That's a tougher one to say. When I found myself being anxious, I realized, oh, I'm in the future, so-called in the future. I'm imagining now. I'm doing what ifs, and I'm suffering. So okay, are these thoughts serving me? And 95+% of the time, it was no. Or if I'm thinking about the past, is this remembering that I'm doing, is this serving me in the moment? 95+% of the time, it was no. And so I stopped, and I brought myself back to the present. And so it was things like that. Basically identifying, sort of making distinctions amongst my thoughts, categorizing them, deciding whether or not they're in line with how I want to see the world, and then either allowing them as is, or modifying them, or cancelling them, over and over and over again. So really no different from the process of, for example, quitting smoking, quitting drinking, breaking any so-called habit, so-called breaking any habit. The process is the same. And what I was working on was this habit, this thinking habit, thinking addiction that modern humans, that I, along with other modern humans, suffer from which I and other modern humans suffer. And I had no idea that this was possible. That this radical change, transformation in my state of mind, this metanoia, was possible. I was utterly convinced that the only human existence was with that babbling little voice. And so I started Googling. I didn't even know what to Google at first. And then, and after a few days, after a couple of weeks, I started finding other people who were making the same claim, that they had turned off their babbling little voice. A guy called Gary Weber, Gareyweber. You'll find a lot of videos from him on YouTube talking about this stuff, some great presentations that he's done, including one called Upgrading Your Mental Operating System that he gave at a conference called Buddhist Geeks. He's done that too. He took 20,000 hours of yoga. Again, sort of took it at something of a superhuman effort. And it seems to be that way. And it takes an intense desire. And it takes real discipline and faith to a certain extent. So I found these guys and reassured myself, hey, I'm not going nuts. Because bear in mind, I had no context for this whatsoever. Okay, I'm not going nuts. Other people have claimed this. And what else is possible? So I think that's good for today, or for this episode. 35 minutes. What else is possible? If that kind of transformation is possible, what else is out there? And that's what I asked myself, and that's what and so maybe I'll talk about what else is out there in the next episode, or maybe I'll go into more detail about the meditation. Or anyway, so I'm here in the jungle, and I set the intention 2-3 years ago of teaching this stuff. Meditation, quiet mind. In Japanese, it's known as Mushin. 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 There's a Wikipedia article about it. It's the Wikipedia defined. I think that there's a quote defining it as a state of mind absent of discursive thought and judgments, entered into by highly trained martial artists during combat. And they go on to say something along the lines of the idea of all martial arts is to develop Mushin while fighting, and then take Mushin from combat into everyday life via one's katas, but one's practicing. And so that's, and you know, they quote a master saying this is actually the goal of all martial arts. So it's still known just about in Japanese. The Japanese still have a word for it. To the best of my knowledge, we don't, we English speakers. It is doable though, and this is what I'm out to teach. So this is why I'm recording podcasts. This is why I am a renunciate. Once I experienced that and became really genuinely rational and sane and free for the first time in my life, rather than being driven almost entirely, largely driven by emotions caused by this babbling automatic thing in my brain that was not under my control, because when I sat down to meditate, I couldn't stop the fucking thing from babbling. It's like, okay, I don't want to be thinking. I'm sitting here with the intention of not thinking. Why is there thinking going on, as I call it then? I don't call it thinking. And if you can't control it, it isn't thinking. That what I came to realize was that what I was doing, one of the things I was doing during meditation is learning to identify what are willed, deliberate thoughts of mine, coming from my soul, if you'll allow me to use that word. And I mean that and had no other, I mean that with no other significance than something that isn't the brain. So willed thought, in my model that I've developed, willed thoughts come from, deliberate thoughts come from that, from the soul, from my real essence. I'm also simultaneously experiencing being in a human body with a brain. And the brain what I realized was I have, over the course of my life, through decades of careless thinking of my own, deliberate thinking, careless, negative thinking, trained automatic circuits in my brain to in quotes, think those things for me. The brain is a pattern recognition unit. It does it brilliantly in lots of different contexts. And one of those is the brain is constantly monitoring for patterns in one's thoughts, perhaps in one's emotions as well. So if one has repeatedly responded to a certain stimulus with certain thoughts, and certain emotions that follow from those thoughts, then that's what the brain learns to replicate and play back to one when a similar context arises. And and therefore the process that I developed is nothing more than being extremely careful with my deliberate thoughts, so that I then reprogram these automatic circuits to respond in all contexts with what's happening right now. What can I smell right now? What can I see right now? What can I taste right now? What can I hear right now? What can I touch right now? But done instantly, quickly. I don't go through the list every time anymore. I did it first. And that's what I've done. And so, with the consequence that I no longer have the cascade of emotions that follow from these what-if thoughts and these regretty thoughts and these guilty thoughts and so on. I don't have the thoughts about those emotions. Oh, I'm sad again. And I don't have emotions about those thoughts, about the emotions, about the thoughts, about the babbling, actually. That's where most of my emotions were coming from. They were responses to this babbling automatic brain thing that then would cause emotions and hormones to run through and would affect my mood, the willed and deliberate thought. I would get caught up in it. And so I said no more. And I retrained the computer that is my brain, that I am sort of experiencing at this time in this current vehicle. And that's what I'm about to teach you, if you want. And this is going to be very informal. You will hear me lighting my smokes. You will hear me lighting my pipe of green. You will hear me making coffee and being distracted by ants, largely because they are everywhere. There are a lot of ants. It's something I've come to realize being here in the rainforest. There are a lot of ants. And if you take nothing more from this podcast than that, then my work here is done.